What's going on, guys? Today we're going to be discussing why you could be losing your cycle on keto carnivore. What's up, guys? Jonathan Shane here, the Keto Road, functional nutritional therapy practitioner specializing in metabolic health and women's hormones. So something that I tend to run into a lot when it comes to clients that come and work with me is when these women have lost their cycle. So they've been keto or carnivore for years now. Everything was going great, and all of a sudden they started to notice some hormonal shifts, lower libido, lower energy, lower ambition, right? And then they lose their cycles. At first, it starts coming late or early, and then it stops coming at all. Some I've worked with went 2 years without a cycle. Some I worked with have gone 4 years without a cycle, etc. And this condition is known as amenorrhea. I never pronounce it right. And the real question that we need to talk about, and what we're going to be discussing today, is why that happens. So you have a better understanding of why it could be happening to you and what you could do about it. So generally, what we notice is that progesterone increases in what's called your luteal phase, and that's what triggers a cycle, right? So you have your menstrual phase, your follicular phase, your ovulation phase, and then your luteal phase. During luteal phase specifically, progesterone starts to creep up, and then when it peaks, everything drops, your lining starts to shed, and you have your cycle. We need to understand, first, before we dive into the whole diet part of this, is that corticosteroids, aka cortisol specifically, dampers the progression and the growth or the increase of the levels of progesterone in your body. Okay, it's really important to understand. So cortisol is too high, progesterone is too low, you're not going to trigger a cycle. Hence why progesterone is given to women that, can't have a cycle. So how does this play into the keto carnivore diet? I have to understand that going from a standard American diet that is super inflammatory and super stressful and super hard on your body to a ketogenic carnivore diet, especially if you have gut issues, insulin resistance, things like that, you're going to notice immediate benefits, right? Blood sugar is going to stabilize, your gut's going to calm down. It's not busy trying to digest a bunch of manufactured fibers or overly processed foods, hyperpalatable foods, food dyes, all that stuff, right? So you get these really good feelings, and it's a very good sensation, and it makes you not want to go back to any kinds of foods. That going on with what you're told is like, this is because of carbs, not because of hyperpalatable foods, not because of hyperprocessed foods, not because of carbs you didn't need, but just carbs in general cause this, right? There's no gray area. There's no separating the weeds, if you will, from the grass. And so you are very focused on never eating carbs again, just eating keto, just eating meat, never doing anything else. And what we need to understand about the ketogenic carnivore diet is that it can be a stressor, okay? Ketosis is a stressful environment, right? It was designed by our ancestors, or designed by God for our ancestors, so that when they were fasting or they were not in a famine, their body would start tapping into body fat, right? It's a stressful environment, right? There's a reason why when your ketones are too high, you can't sleep. It's because your body wants you to go hunt something, okay? That doesn't mean that there weren't civilizations that were in ketosis or very much a primary fat burning society for the length of their culture, their civilization. But it does mean that when you're in a famined state, it's much harder to go to sleep, right? It's a stressful environment, right? And so that stress is there. Now, for a lot of people, mostly men and then some women, this stress is not enough to have any issues, right? It's very mild. It's a mild stressor, right? Your blood sugar goes to dip low, and your body just releases a little bit of cortisol. You restabilize. You don't even realize it's happening. It's so simple, right? And everything else in their life isn't enough to do that. Now, for other women, it's different. For other women, your cycle could be really stressful. Maybe you have PMDD. Maybe you're developing PMDD, which we can talk about carnivore-induced PMDD in another video. Maybe you just have really intense PMS. That's a stressor. Maybe you have 5 kids. That's a stressor. Maybe you have to work full-time. That's a stressor. Maybe you're an athlete too. That's a stressor. And so all these things start to add up, right? And so keto carnivore, while they remove the amount of stress you got from a standard American diet, that little bit of stress that it gives you, while not noticeable at first, starts to build over time, and you start to get to a place where you're chronically stressed. When that happens, cortisol is chronic, glucose is chronic, insulin is chronic. Over time, that makes inflammation chronic. You're kind of in the same kind of situation you were in when you were constantly eating carbs, except it's happening internally. This is something called physiological insulin resistance. I've talked about it at talks, and I can make another video about it. If you want to see that, let me know in the comments. Point being here, though, is that physiological insulin resistance creates a chronic cortisol environment. which suppresses progesterone. And so we get to a point where women lose their cycles. How do I know that is the issue? Because of the solutions that we come up with. So one solution is managing your stress. There are voluntary and involuntary stressors in your life. Voluntary are things that you're choosing to do, and then involuntary are things you can't choose to do. What is involuntary? Your kids. You can't get rid of your kids. Your job is not, I wouldn't really call that involuntary. You can always find another job. Maybe not right now, but you can start looking. You can go through that transition. But your cycle, your hormones, your body, can't really get rid of those, right? Maybe you're an endurance athlete, and that's involuntary, not because you can't give it up, because you won't, right? So now you have your involuntary stressors. You try to get rid of your voluntary ones, right? If you're in a stressful relationship, try to get out of it or work through it, right? If you're in a stressful marriage, work through it, right? Like start to deal with that thing. If you have bad sleep management, deal with it, right? Those kinds of things, okay? If that doesn't solve the problem, then we have to do what's called nutritional therapy, which works for me because I'm a nutritional therapist. The only macronutrient isolated of caloric metrics, meaning like fats and proteins, for example, you need a certain amount of calories for them to induce a certain relaxing cortisol suppressing effect. The only macronutrient isolated from caloric amount that's shown to directly impact cortisol levels in a positive way are carbohydrates. Now, this isn't a funnel cake we're talking about. We're talking about whole food carbohydrates, which makes sense. If we used to be hunter-gatherers, right, and women while some hunted, tended to be more gatherers, they would have grazed more on the carbohydrates, the tubers, and the whole foods they would have found to have with the meat that the men were hunting. It makes sense that biologically, they've adapted to more carbohydrates around different phases of the moon when fruits are more ripe. Like when you start to really dig into anthropology around this, it makes sense. So understanding that carbohydrates, whole food based ones, can be good for women's cycles at different times of their cycle. How do I know this works? Because I've implemented it. I've given women just simply a cup of rice. Keto, completely keto carnivore, the rest of their diet, but a cup of rice a day. And within 30 days, they had their first cycle in 2 years. I've done the same with squash. I've done the same with sweet potato. Someone that was going into what seemed to be perimenopause, we re-regulated her cycle through whole food carbohydrates, and she was able to go another 2 or 3 years with a regular cycle, right? That perimenopause was stress-induced due to the way she was eating, right? And her training regimen and things like that. So understand that there are ways out of it. You have to be willing to figure out what you need to do. Do you need to remove some voluntary stressors out of your life? And if you do and that doesn't work, do we need to nutritionally, therapeutically introduce strategic carbohydrates? You could start with having just 20 to 30 carbs, of sweet potato or something like that immediately post-workout. You could focus on just having them, if it's really severe, having 50 to 60 grams of whole food carbs and then eating keto the rest of the day. You could do that until you start. You can slowly increase it until you start. Another good recommendation is to get some blood labs. Let's look at your blood labs and see what your hormones are and then go from there. So I hope this gave you some answers if you're struggling with this. I hope this at least gave you a direction. It's hard to give exact implementation because I'm not working with you directly, but I hope this started to give you a little bit of focus and things to focus on. So appreciate y'all. If you have any questions, put it in the comment section below. Like and subscribe. I'll talk to you on the next one.